A bowl of boiling soup spilled on a 64-year-old woman sounds like a minor accident. Yet when the scent of burnt skin mixed with my daughter-in-law's flawless apology, I knew I was being tested for a crueler plan. I stayed silent, letting them think I was weak and stupid. They had no idea that every whispered word and conspiratorial glance was being recorded. By dawn, the flashing lights outside would reveal just who the real prey was. My name is Eleanor Hartley. I am 64 years old, a widow living in the quiet, tree-lined enclave of Maple Ridge, just on the edge of the Chicago suburbs. And I am currently sitting at my mahogany dining table with my left arm wrapped in thick white gauze. The fabric is clean, but the skin underneath is angry and raw, pulsing with a heat that has not subsided since last night. I look at the empty chair opposite me, then at the window where the first grey light of dawn is beginning to bleed through the curtains. My expression is calm. It is the kind of terrifying calmness that only comes when you have stopped crying over the people you love and started calculating exactly how to destroy them. The incident happened 18 hours ago. It was supposed to be a cozy family dinner. My daughter-in-law, Brooke, had prepared a tomato bisque, heavy with cream and spices, simmering in the big pot until it was bubbling like magma. I remember standing up from my chair to reach for the pepper mill. That was when Brooke passed behind me. She did not trip over the rug. She did not lose her balance on the hardwood. I felt the deliberate shift in her weight, the way she leaned in just as the heavy ceramic tureen tipped. The liquid was scalding. It hit my chest and splashed down my left arm, a thick, red curtain of fire that clung to my skin. The smell of burnt tomato mixed instantly with the smell of my own searing flesh. I did not scream. I gasped. A sharp intake of air that felt like swallowing glass. But what hurt more than the burn was the sound that followed. My son, Michael, my only child, did not leap from his chair. He did not rush to grab a towel or call for ice. He laughed. It was a short, forced chuckle, followed by a comment that cut deeper than the heat. He said I was getting old and that my reflexes were too slow to get out of the way. The table went silent. Brooke was already on her knees, wiping the floor with a napkin, her eyes glistening with tears that looked practiced, whispering apologies that sounded too perfect to be real. My husband, Daniel, would have burned the world down for me. We built Hartley home and yard together, brick by brick, expanding from a single hardware store to a chain of 5 profitable locations across the greater Chicago area. When Daniel died of a sudden stroke 2 years ago, collapsing right there in the aisle between the paint mixers and the power tools, he left me with a broken heart and assets totaling over $5 million. I thought that money was our legacy. I did not realize it was a dinner bell for wolves. Michael was once the boy who brought me dandelions from the yard. Now, he is the man who watched his mother burn and made a joke about it. The house used to feel so big after Daniel passed. The silence in this 2-story timber home was deafening. I used to lie awake listening to the furnace kick on, the refrigerator hum, and the floorboards settle, feeling the crushing weight of solitude. That was how they got in. Michael and Brooke started visiting more often, claiming they did not want me to be alone with the ghosts. I believed them because I wanted to believe them. I reach into the pocket of my silk robe. My fingers brush against the cool metal of a small digital voice recorder. It was taped securely beneath the bandages on my arm, hidden against the non-burned skin. Last night was not an accident, and this dinner was not the first time I had prepared for pain. I realized weeks ago that they were no longer my son and daughter-in-law. They were predators, and I was the aging, injured gazelle. I stayed quiet when the soup hit me because screaming would have alerted them. Silence made them think I was in shock. Silence made them think I was feeble. Outside, the low hum of an engine cuts through the morning quiet. I look out the window. A police cruiser has just pulled up to the curb, its lights flashing silently, painting the front lawn in strokes of red and blue. Across the street, I see my neighbours stepping onto their porches, pulling their robes tight against the dawn chill, watching with curiosity. Inside the house, Michael and Brooke are still asleep upstairs, dreaming of the inheritance they think is just a few months away. They do not know that the game is already over. I press my thumb against the recorder in my pocket and whisper into the empty room. It is time. 3 years ago, before the silence and the secrets took over my home, Daniel and I were the heartbeat of Maple Ridge. Hartley Home and Yard was never just a place to buy a hammer or a gallon of eggshell paint. It was where the community gathered. People came in for advice on how to fix a leaky faucet and stayed for the free coffee we kept brewing near the entrance. We were not just business owners. We were neighbours, friends, and the steady pulse of a town that valued a firm handshake over a corporate contract. Then came the day the pulse stopped. Daniel died on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of the main store. He collapsed between a shelf of galvanized screws and a display of exterior waterproofing sealant. It happened so fast that a customer in the next aisle thought he had simply slipped on a loose tile. I remember kneeling beside him, gripping his hand as the warmth drained out of it, realizing with a terrifying clarity that 38 years of partnership had been severed in a single heartbeat. I was not just losing a husband, I was losing the only person who truly knew me. At the funeral, Michael held me longer than he ever had since he was a child. He whispered that he would take care of everything and that I should not worry about a single bill or burden. He insisted on staying with me for a few weeks, claiming he could not bear the thought of me drifting through that big house alone. Brooke stood just behind him, her hand resting gently on his back, her eyes rimmed with red and her voice soft. She played the role of the devastated daughter-in-law perfectly, nodding in agreement that family needed to be together during such a dark time. Those few weeks quietly mutated into a permanent arrangement. It started innocently enough with a few overnight bags. Then came the boxes. Within 2 months, my guest room had vanished beneath a vanity table cluttered with expensive makeup and a large gaming chair that Michael insisted he needed for his back. Their cars, a sleek sedan and a sporty coupe, pushed my reliable old station wagon out of the garage and onto the driveway. They did not ask to move in. They simply accumulated space until there was no room left to argue. The changes were subtle at first, disguised as acts of kindness. Brooke began collecting the mail from the box at the end of the driveway every day, claiming she wanted to save me the walk in the cold. She started filtering through the envelopes, handing me only the junk mail and keeping the bills to sort later. Michael insisted on installing a banking application on my phone, but he set it up with his own password, telling me it was for my convenience so I would not have to remember another complicated code. I was torn between gratitude and a gnawing sense of displacement. Having them in the house did push back the crushing loneliness of widowhood, but it also felt like my own life was being erased. The sound of Brooke laughing on the phone in my kitchen and the blue glow of the television Michael left on all night made me feel like a guest in my own home. I came downstairs one morning to find they had taken down a portrait of Daniel and me from the hallway and replaced it with a framed photo of themselves on vacation. They had not asked. They just assumed the wall space was theirs. Then came the financial requests. Michael sat me down one evening with a serious look on his face. He wanted to be named co-manager of the store to reduce my workload. He suggested we sign a temporary financial power of attorney because, as he put it, signing checks by hand was too tiring for my wrists. I agreed to it all. I signed the papers because I wanted to believe my son was stepping up to fill his father's shoes. I wanted to trust that his intentions were as pure as the boy I had raised. The first crack in that trust appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. I was walking past the guest room when I heard Brooke talking on her phone. The door was ajar. Her voice was low but clear. She told someone that I was easy to handle and that they only needed to mention Daniel to make me tear up and agree to anything. I froze. Before I could process the cruelty of her words, she turned and saw me. She hung up immediately and flashed a bright, empty smile, acting as if she had been talking about the weather. I forced myself to dismiss it. I told myself I was being sensitive, that grief was making me paranoid. But the seed of suspicion had been planted deep in the soil of my mind. I started watching them closely. I noticed the way Brooke's eyes would sharpen whenever the topic of my will came up in conversation. I noticed how Michael would deftly change the subject every time I asked for a report on the store's weekly revenue. I was not ready to admit the truth yet, but I was no longer sleeping soundly in the house that was slowly ceasing to be mine. The requests did not start as demands. They arrived as opportunities wrapped in the guise of ambition. It began with Michael sitting across from me at the kitchen island, his hands clasped on the granite countertop, looking every bit the eager successor to his father. He told me he needed $40,000 to enroll in an elite retail management seminar series that would provide the blueprint for expanding Hartley Home and Yard into the neighboring states. He spoke with such conviction about legacy and growth that I did not hesitate. I signed the transfer order, believing I was investing in the future of the family business, completely unaware that I was merely funding the first installment of my own destruction. Less than 3 weeks later, the emotional assault began. Brooke knocked on my bedroom door late one evening, her eyes swollen and red. She told me through sobbing breaths that her mother in Tennessee had suffered a severe cardiac event and needed emergency heart surgery. She said the insurance would not cover the deductible and the immediate fees, which totaled $25,000. I did not ask to see a hospital bill. I did not ask for a doctor's name. I simply transferred the funds immediately because I believed that the mother of my daughter-in-law was family, and family helps each other survive. From there, the floodgates opened. The requests became frequent and frantic, a constant barrage of financial emergencies and once-in-a-lifetime chances. There was a perfect real estate investment that required immediate capital. A plumbing disaster in a rental property Michael claimed the landlord refused to fix, and a complete transmission failure on Brooke's luxury SUV. In a single year, the cumulative total of these withdrawals exceeded $200,000. Whenever I hesitated or asked when they might be able to begin a repayment plan, Michael would pat my shoulder with a condescending gentleness and tell me not to worry. He assured me that every penny was documented and that the future profits from his projects would pay me back double. Brooke would chime in with warm hugs, promising that their success was only so they could care for me with the highest quality of life until my final days. I eventually noticed a pattern that I should have seen sooner. They never asked for money when they were in the room together. It was always a calculated isolation tactic. Michael would corner me when Brooke was at work, or Brooke would approach me when Michael was allegedly at the store. It was a performance designed to keep me off balance, but the reality of their coordination became undeniably clear on a Sunday morning that shattered whatever illusions I had left. I was coming down the stairs, my hand sliding silently along the banister. When I heard their voices drifting up from the kitchen, they were speaking in low tones, but the acoustics of the hallway carried every syllable. Brooke asked him straight out when I was going to fully collapse so they would not have to keep begging for scraps. Her voice was devoid of affection, stripped of the sweetness she performed for me daily. Michael laughed, a sound that chilled my blood, and replied that I was tough and might linger for another 15 or 20 years. My heart seemed to stop in my chest. I stood frozen on the landing as the conversation turned darker. Brooke mentioned that she had spoken to a contact at Silvercrest Guardianship Services, a private firm that specialized in assuming legal authority over seniors deemed incompetent. She asked Michael when they could proceed with Phase 2 of the plan. I stopped breathing. They were not just trying to spend my money. They were discussing the legal framework to strip me of my autonomy, to declare me unfit so they could seize control of every asset Daniel and I had built. I backed up the stairs, my legs trembling, and hid inside the bathroom, through the vents. I heard Brooke laugh again and say that if I continued to be this soft, she would not even have to do much to push me over the edge. That was the moment the blindfold was ripped away. I realized I was not a mother to him, and I was not a mother-in-law to her. I was simply a bank account that breathed. That night, lying in the bed where Daniel used to sleep, I stared at the ceiling and accepted a hard truth. The old Eleanor, the one who believed blood relations were sacred, had died in that kitchen hallway. A new Eleanor was born in the dark, one who understood that to survive these predators, I would have to become far more ruthless than they could ever imagine. I made an appointment with Jonah Pierce under the pretense of a standard year-end tax review. Jonah had been our accountant since Daniel opened the doors of the first store, a man who treated ledgers with the reverence of Holy Scripture. When I walked into his office, he greeted me with his usual warmth, but I saw his smile falter when he looked into my eyes. He recognized the tension radiating from me, the tight set of my jaw that I could not quite relax, but to his credit, he did not ask personal questions. He simply opened his laptop and waited for my instructions. I asked him to pull up a complete transaction history for both the Hartley home and yard business accounts and my personal holdings for the last 18 months. I told him I wanted to see everything, down to the penny. Jonah hesitated for a fraction of a second when he began scrolling through the data. He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the screen, his brow furrowing as he highlighted a series of transfers that had escaped my notice. He pointed out a pattern of withdrawals ranging from $2,000 to $3,000, all occurring on Tuesdays. That was the day I habitually spent at our South Branch location, leaving Michael in charge of the administrative paperwork at the main office. In total, nearly $70,000 had been siphoned quietly into a secondary account where Michael was listed as a sub-signer. The smaller thefts were just the beginning. Jonah navigated to the larger expenditures, and the screen filled with unauthorized activity that made my stomach turn. There was a wire transfer covering 12 months of rent up front for a loft apartment in downtown Chicago listed in Brooke's name. There were invoices for high-end designer furniture and receipts for business class tickets to Las Vegas. Every single one of these transactions had been authorized using my electronic signature. Jonah looked at me grimly and explained that the only way this was possible was if someone had full administrative access to my mobile banking application. It was the same application Michael had insisted on installing for me to make my life easier. Jonah leaned back and suggested I consider filing a police report immediately, as this was clear embezzlement. I shook my head. I told him to freeze Michael's access to all accounts instantly, but to do it without sending any notification. I wanted them to find out the hard way, standing at a register with a declined card. I left his office clutching a thick binder of printed evidence. My head was spinning, but my heart was ice. The total amount missing was over $280,000. The money was substantial, yet what hurt most was the premeditation. This was not a desperate act of a child in trouble. This was a systematic harvesting of my life's work. That night, I did not confront them. Instead, I sat in the dark of my study and opened my laptop. I searched for private investigators who specialized in elder financial abuse and family fraud. I bypassed the flashy agencies and found a name that appeared in several legal forums with high praise: Dana Ruiz. She was a former investigator for the Chicago Police Department who had left the force to work privately. I sent an email, and we met the next morning in a coffee shop on the other side of town where I knew no one would recognize me. I slid the binder Jonah had prepared across the small table. I recounted everything, from the fake smiles to the conversation I had overheard in the kitchen. When I mentioned the name Silvercrest Guardianship Services, Dana stopped stirring her coffee. She looked up, her eyes sharp and knowing. She told me she had seen this specific model of fraud before. She explained how the children, often guided by a spouse, would team up with a private guardianship firm and a corrupt doctor to declare the senior incompetent. She warned me that if they succeeded, I would lose the right to spend my own money, choose my own doctor, or even live in my own home. Dana leaned in and lowered her voice, her tone shifting from sympathetic to strategic. She told me that if I had the stomach for it, we should not just stop them. We should set a trap and let them destroy themselves. I looked at her and nodded. I was ready to play the long game. Dana went to work with the efficiency of a machine. She used telephoto lenses and long-range microphones to track their movements, and she combed through public records that I never knew existed. Every evening, I received an encrypted email with her findings. Opening those files became an addiction. I was terrified of what I would see. Yet I felt a strange surge of power, knowing that I was finally seeing the world as it truly was. The first revelation was the apartment. Michael and Brooke had sworn they gave up their lease in West Haven to move in with me. That was a lie. Dana's investigation proved they were still paying rent on the unit every month. It was their private sanctuary, a place where they could escape the burden of living with an old woman. The photographs Dana attached showed them entering the building with bags from high-end designers and cases of expensive wine. There were shots of them bringing friends over for parties on Friday nights, while I sat at home thinking they were working late. They were living a double life, funded entirely by the money I thought was securing our family's future. The background check on Brooke was far more disturbing. Dana sat me down and laid out a timeline that looked less like a resume and more like a criminal record. Before she met Michael, Brooke had been married to a 71-year-old man in Florida named Gregory Lane. He died only 9 months after their wedding due to a slip in the bathtub. Brooke walked away with nearly $400,000 and a vacation home. Before Gregory, she had lived with a businessman in Ohio who was in his 60s. He suffered a sudden stroke, and though they were not married, he had transferred the bulk of his liquid assets into a joint investment account with Brooke just weeks before he lost his faculties. The intent became undeniable when Dana found the emails. She recovered deleted correspondence between Brooke and an intake specialist at Silvercrest Guardianship Services. Brooke had asked specific questions about the process of declaring a senior citizen incompetent and how to arrange for a flexible psychological evaluation. The final line of her email read that she believed her mother-in-law in Illinois was the perfect candidate. Then came the surveillance of the meetings. Dana captured clear images of Brooke sitting in a dimly lit booth at an upscale bar with a man named Alan Royce, the lead attorney for Silvercrest. They looked like they were plotting a corporate merger. They laughed over cocktails and exchanged thick manila envelopes, but the pictures were nothing compared to the audio. I sat in Dana's office, staring at the spinning reels of digital audio software, and listened to my daughter-in-law's voice cut through the static. She told Alan that I was still too sharp and that they needed to help me look less lucid. Alan replied with a terrifying casualness. He suggested she start slipping mild sedatives into my evening tea and mentioned he had a doctor on his payroll who would certify whatever condition they needed. The final blow was a printed stack of screenshots from a private social media group called the Exit Plan Club. It was a forum where Brooke and other women shared war stories about their relationships with older men. They bragged about their windfalls and traded tips on how to tell sob stories to trigger the compassion of wealthy seniors. Seeing my life reduced to a strategy in a chat room turned my hesitation into cold resolve. My suspicion had solidified into hard evidence. I was not just dealing with a greedy family. I was the target of a professional operation. With the scope of their betrayal laid bare, I knew I had to act fast, but I could not act rashly. I began to lay the defensive groundwork immediately. I secretly met with my personal attorney, Harper Cole, of the small but fierce firm Cole and Merritt. We completely restructured my will. I left the bulk of my estate to a foundation supporting elderly victims of financial abuse. With a significant portion set aside for a niece in North Carolina I had not seen in years, but who had always been kind. Michael was left with a symbolic sum, small enough to be an insult, but legally significant enough to show he was not forgotten by accident. Harper also helped me draft a new medical power of attorney. I designated Miriam Fox, my best friend of 40 years, as the sole person authorized to make decisions for me if I became incapacitated. This legal firewall ensured that neither Michael nor Brooke could ever use Silvercrest to seize control of my health. Back at home, I began the performance of a lifetime. I had to make them believe their plan was working. I started leaving my keys in the refrigerator. I would ask the same question 3 times during a single meal. One morning, I deliberately put salt in my coffee and then apologized, claiming my mind was just a little foggy lately. Brooke's reaction was immediate. She would turn to Michael, making sure her voice was just loud enough for me to hear, and whisper that she was worried I was showing early signs of Alzheimer's. Michael would stay silent, but I saw the relief in his eyes. He thought the path to his freedom was opening up. While they were busy celebrating my decline, I was busy watching them. I installed miniature cameras throughout the house. One was hidden in a picture frame in the dining room, another in a vase on the shoe cabinet, and a third embedded in the porch light. All of them streamed data directly to a secure server that only Dana could access. I watched video after video of Brooke practicing her lies with her friends, describing me as a danger to myself, even inventing a story about me almost burning the house down the previous week. The tension escalated when Michael brought home a thick folder bearing the Silvercrest logo. He tried to frame it as a backup plan, a way to have professionals manage my finances so I would not have to worry. I pretended to be frightened and asked for a few days to think about it. That hesitation was all they needed to believe I was crumbling. In my meetings with Dana, I practiced keeping my hands steady while listening to recordings of Michael laughing about his upcoming financial freedom, which they had nicknamed Operation Sunset. Every laugh I heard killed the mother in me a little more, but it fed the survivor. Dana eventually told me that we needed a tipping point. We needed an act of violence or a gross error that would be impossible to explain away. I looked at her and told her I would give them the opportunity to do the next terrible thing. But this time, I would be standing ready on the other side. The dinner was Brooke's idea. She called it an intimate family gathering, a way to make amends after weeks of tension regarding my failing memory. It was a chilly evening in early winter, and the house smelled rich with the scent of roasted garlic and heavy cream. Brooke was in the kitchen, humming as she stirred a large pot of tomato bisque, claiming it was my favorite comfort food. I watched her from the living room, knowing that every move she made was a performance. I had prepared for this night with the precision of an actress stepping onto a stage. Before we sat down, I made sure to let my hand tremble visibly while pouring a glass of water. I gripped the banister of the staircase with both hands, pausing for a long moment as if I had forgotten how to descend. I needed them to believe I was fading. I needed them to feel confident. Dana had confirmed earlier that morning that every hidden camera in the kitchen and dining room was recording in high definition. The trap was set. We sat at the table, the lighting dim and warm. Brooke began to regale Michael with stories about a client at Silvercrest. She spoke of an elderly woman who refused to admit her mind was slipping and ended up setting her own kitchen on fire. Every detail of the story was a thinly veiled insult directed at me. She looked at me with wide, concerned eyes, waiting for me to react to the implication that I was a danger to myself. I simply offered a vague, confused smile and pretended not to understand the malice beneath her words. Brooke stood up to serve the soup. She carried the heavy ceramic tureen, walking slowly behind my chair. The camera hidden in the chandelier would later show her glancing quickly toward the front porch, checking for witnesses out of habit, unaware that the real witness was capturing her every breath. I chose that moment to act. I placed my hands on the table and began to rise, reaching for the pepper mill on the far side. I heard the scuff of a shoe against the rug. It was a clumsy, theatrical sound. Brooke did not stumble. She lunged. I felt her weight shift, and then her hands went up, tipping the pot forward with terrifying accuracy. The liquid was boiling. It cascaded over my left shoulder, soaking through my blouse and scalding the skin of my arm and chest instantly. The pain was blinding. It felt as though a layer of skin had been stripped away and replaced with fire. The smell of burnt dairy and seared flesh filled the air immediately. My instinct was to scream, to lash out and accuse her of the assault I knew it was. But I swallowed the scream. I let out only a dry, ragged moan, clutching my arm and sinking back into the chair. Through the haze of agony, I locked eyes with Brooke. There was no panic in her gaze. For a split second, before the mask of horror slid into place, she was studying me. She was checking to see if I would break. Michael leaped from his seat. He shouted her name, asking what she had done. But his concern pivoted instantly to accusation. He looked at me, writhing in the chair, and told me that I should have stayed seated. He said that if I did not move around so much with my slow reflexes, this never would have happened. He was already rewriting the narrative, turning her violence into my negligence. Brooke fell to her knees beside me, weeping loudly. She grabbed napkins and dabbed uselessly at my burns, sobbing that she was sorry and that she never meant for it to happen. But as she leaned in close, under the guise of comforting me, she whispered to Michael. Her voice was low, barely a breath, but the microphone taped beneath the collar of my nightgown caught every syllable. She said that this might be for the best. She said that when the doctors saw the severity of the burns, they would have no choice but to recommend immediate professional guardianship. The ambulance ride was a blur of vibration and stinging cold. My arm was wrapped, but the pain radiated through my entire body. Yet, beneath the physical suffering, my mind was crystal clear. The soup was a test. They wanted to see if I would snap. They wanted to see if I was defenseless. But it was also a gift. They had given me undeniable physical proof of abuse. In the emergency room, after the nurses had cut away my ruined shirt and treated the blisters, I asked for a moment of privacy. I pulled the small recorder from its hiding place. I pressed play. The sound of the soup splashing, my gasp, Michael's victim blaming, and Brooke's damning whisper were all there. The audio was pristine. I picked up my phone and typed a single message to Dana. The prey just took the bait. Now it is our turn. I spent 4 days in the hospital, not just healing, but rehearsing. I played the part of the traumatized, fading widow to perfection. I flinched visibly whenever a nurse brought in a hot meal. I deliberately asked for my morning medication twice in 1 hour. I even called the young night nurse by the name of a woman who had retired from my husband's store 10 years ago. Brooke was there for every slip, her face twisted into a mask of performative concern, recounting each of my errors to the doctors with a heavy, sorrowful sigh. However, I dropped the act the moment Brooke left the room to fetch coffee. I asked to speak privately with the attending physician, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s named Dr. Evans. I sat up straight, my voice steady and sharp, and told her everything. I listed the missing funds, the conversations about guardianship, and the convenient timing of the accident. Dr. Evans was stunned. She listened without interrupting, and then she promised me that my medical records would reflect that I was completely oriented, lucid, and showing 0 signs of cognitive decline. That medical file was my shield. While I laid the groundwork in the hospital, my team was building a weapon on the outside. Dana, Jonah, and my attorney, Harper, constructed a meticulous timeline that connected every dot. They mapped the date of Brooke's first email to Silvercrest against the dates of the unauthorized wire transfers. They overlaid the messages from the Exit Plan Club with the sudden spike in household accidents. It was no longer just a theory. It was a clear picture of a conspiracy that had been in motion for over a year. I decided it was time to pull the noose tighter. I signed a temporary order removing Michael's access to all business and personal accounts, effective immediately. On Dana's advice, I left a single checking account active with a balance of $30,000. It was a specific amount, large enough to be tempting, but small enough to cause panic when they realized everything else was gone. It was the bait designed to make them desperate. The reaction was instantaneous. 2 days later, my porch camera captured Michael and Brooke storming up the driveway after a dinner out. Their credit card had been declined. Michael was shouting that Brooke had promised her lawyers would handle everything. Brooke screamed back that he was useless and could not even control his own mother. They were unraveling right on my doorstep, terrified and turning on each other, completely unaware that their confession was being recorded in high-definition audio and video. I returned home the following evening. My arm was still heavily bandaged, but I insisted I was fine. Brooke welcomed me with a lavish dinner, trying to cover her earlier panic with excessive sweetness. Halfway through the meal, she cleared her throat and mentioned that she had arranged for a friendly psychological evaluation at the house. She claimed it was just to help me feel more secure and that the doctor was a specialist from Silvercrest. I pretended to hesitate. I looked at my hands, feigned a moment of confusion, and then nodded slowly. I saw the relief wash over her face. She thought she had won. She did not know that Harper had already taken our evidence to the district attorney. The police were not just interested, they were furious. They had secured a warrant for Alan Royce and were launching a full investigation into Silvercrest. We agreed on the final plan. I would host the consultation dinner with Alan and his corrupt doctor. I would let them incriminate themselves one last time. Then, at dawn, the police would execute the raid. I spent the final hours preparing my house like a stage set. I adjusted the dining chairs to ensure every face would be captured by the camera hidden in the china cabinet. I taped a backup voice recorder to the underside of the table, right where Alan would sit. I stood in the center of the room, looking at the spot on the floor where the soup had burned me weeks ago. I felt a cold sense of anticipation. The last time we were all in this room, I was the victim of a lie. This time, the only thing that would spill across this floor was the truth. The evaluation began at 7 o'clock. Alan Royce swept into my dining room with the confidence of a man who had never lost a negotiation, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. He introduced Dr. Palmer, a balding man with tired eyes, as an old friend who just wanted to chat. Michael sat across from me, flashing that boyish grin that used to melt my heart, assuring me that this was just a casual conversation for fun. Brooke poured a glass of expensive red wine, playing the role of the devoted daughter-in-law who was simply exhausted from worrying about my mental health. Dr. Palmer did not waste time. He leaned forward and started the standard cognitive battery disguised as small talk. He asked me the date, the name of the current president, and then asked me to repeat 3 specific words he had mentioned earlier. I played my part carefully. I answered 2 questions correctly, but deliberately stumbled on the third, furrowing my brow as if the word had just slipped away. I saw Palmer make a small, satisfied check mark on his notepad. It was the sign of mild cognitive decline they needed to build their case. Brooke seized the moment to escalate the narrative. She leaned in toward the doctor, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, and claimed that I frequently called out for Daniel as if he were still alive. She told them I had tried to back the car out of the garage last week without opening the door. These were absolute lies. I had never done either of those things. My chest burned from the healing scald marks, but I sat perfectly still, offering only a weak, confused smile, while my eyes remained cold and observant. Alan took over, spreading a series of documents across the table. He explained the concept of guardianship in soothing, patronizing tones. He said Silvercrest would help manage my assets to ensure I received the best possible care. Michael feigned a moment of hesitation, asking if I would still have the freedom to spend money on the store. Alan smoothly dodged the question, pivoting back to the benefits of protection and safety. It was a rehearsed routine, and they performed it flawlessly. I knew that just 50 feet away, sitting in a dark sedan down the street. Dana was listening to every word alongside Harper and a police lieutenant. The hidden microphones were transmitting the entire charade in real time. They heard the lies, the manipulation, and the predetermined outcome. The climax of the evening arrived when Alan pushed a document toward me labeled Initial Consent. He offered me a heavy fountain pen. Brooke placed her hand over mine, guiding the pen toward the signature line. She looked me in the eye and whispered that I did not need to understand the legal details and that I just needed to trust them. I almost laughed. The arrogance was staggering. They still believed I was the fragile prey they had targeted months ago. I gently placed the pen back on the table. I told them I needed to use the restroom because my arm was throbbing from the burn. Once I was safely behind the locked bathroom door, I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message to Dana saying they had just asked for the signature and that I was ready. I flushed the toilet for effect and returned to the dining room, putting on a mask of exhaustion and confusion. I told Alan that I was too tired to read through the papers tonight, but promised to look them over in the morning. I left the documents on the table, unsigned. It was enough to keep them satisfied without giving them what they wanted. They exchanged glances and agreed, convinced that the deal was as good as done. When they finally stood to leave, the clock showed it was past 11. Brooke hugged me at the door, squeezing tight, and promised she would not let anyone harm me. I felt the chill of her hypocrisy against my skin. As Michael stepped out onto the porch, he leaned close to his wife and whispered that it would only be a few more weeks. He had no idea that those words were the final nail in his coffin, recorded clearly by the device taped under the table. I went upstairs to my empty bedroom and placed the recorder under my pillow. My arm ached with a sharp, rhythmic pain, but I did not take a sleeping pill. I lay awake, watching the window, knowing that in just a few hours the sky would turn from black to pale blue. I had swallowed their poison for months in silence. But when the sun came up, I was going to spit it back in their faces in front of the entire neighborhood. Dawn broke over Maple Ridge with a heavy mist clinging to the manicured lawns. The silence of the street was broken not by sirens, but by the low rumble of tires on pavement. 3 police cruisers and a sedan from the district attorney's office rolled to a stop in front of my house, their lights flashing silently in the morning gloom. A few neighbors who were out collecting their newspapers froze in their tracks, pulling their robes tighter as they exchanged confused glances. They were used to seeing this house as a place of tragedy, not a crime scene. I had been awake for hours. I sat on the living room sofa, my burned arm resting on a pillow, flanked by my attorney, Harper, and my oldest friend, Miriam. When the doorbell rang, I did not hesitate. I walked to the door and opened it to let the lieutenant, Dana, and 2 uniformed officers step into the warmth of the foyer. Behind them, I could see the silhouette of Mrs. Higgins from across the street peering through her window. The audience was assembled. The sound of heavy boots on the hardwood floor woke them up. Michael and Brooke came stumbling down the stairs in their pajamas, their faces puffy with sleep and confusion. Brooke immediately started shouting, demanding to know what was happening, while Michael puffed out his chest and asked who dared to enter his home without a warrant. The lieutenant did not blink. He calmly produced a folded document stamped by the court and read the charges aloud. They included fraud, conspiracy to commit unlawful guardianship, and elder abuse. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Dana stepped forward and turned on the large television mounted above the fireplace. She connected her tablet and pressed play. The screen filled with high-definition footage of Brooke sitting in the bar with Alan, exchanging envelopes and laughing. Then came the audio from the kitchen, Michael joking about Operation Sunset. Then, the footage from the dining room played, the sound of the soup splashing, my gasp of pain, and Michael's voice blaming me for my own injury boomed through the speakers. We had left the front door open, and the audio drifted out onto the porch where the neighbors were now gathering. Brooke screamed that it was all fake and staged. Dana simply tapped the screen again. The recording from last night played next. Brooke's lie about the fire, her request to make me look less lucid, and Alan's instructions on how to drug me filled the room. Brooke went pale. Her face, usually so composed and made up, looked like cracked porcelain in the harsh light of the television. Harper stepped forward and dropped a heavy file on the coffee table. It contained Jonah's forensic accounting report, the photos of the secret loft, and the printed logs from the exit plan club. The lieutenant picked up a sheet of paper and read aloud a text message where Brooke mocked my grief over Daniel. Outside, the murmurs of the neighbours grew louder. Michael collapsed onto the nearest chair when the video of the soup incident played a second time. He watched himself tell me to sit still and realised there was no spinning this. He stammered that he did not think it would go this far. But his words died in his throat as the lieutenant signalled for the officers to advance. This was the moment Brooke broke. Her eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. She tried to bolt toward the back door, but a female officer intercepted her, spinning her around and slamming the handcuffs onto her wrists right in front of the large bay window. The entire street could see her face twisted in terror and rage. It was exactly as I had promised myself. At dawn, everyone saw her panic. I did not scream. I did not cry. I stood by the doorframe and looked her in the eye. I told her that she had always wanted the town to see her as the perfect daughter-in-law. I said that her wish had come true. Only now they saw exactly what kind of person she really was. Brooke spat a curse at me, thrashing against the restraints as they hauled her out the door. Michael was led out behind her. He stopped for a second, looking back at me with red, tear-filled eyes. He started to say he was sorry, but I cut him off. My voice was steady. I told him that he had chosen to stand with the people who saw me as nothing more than a wallet. I told him that today. I chose to stand by myself. The heavy doors of the police cruisers slammed shut. The morning sun was fully up now, reflecting off the metal of the cars as they pulled away. The lieutenant assured me that the process for prosecution would begin immediately and that Silvercrest was already being raided. Harper suggested I go inside and rest, but I shook my head. I stood on the porch for a few minutes longer. The neighbours were no longer looking at me with pity for the poor, frail widow. They were looking at me with the respect due to a woman who had saved her own life. I turned back inside and closed the heavy oak door, shutting out the noise of the street. I walked into the kitchen and looked at the spot on the floor where the soup had spilled. It was clean now. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove to boil. As the water heated up, I picked up the small voice recorder from the table. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight, and then I slid the switch to the off position. I did not need to record anything else. The story was done. Thanks so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you guys are tuning in from. So drop your city or country in the comments below, because it is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this one, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this story get heard by even more people.